The downfall of Napoleon, the Russian campaign, and the last battles in the previous video titled The Greatest Victories in Napoleon Bonaparte's Life. We explored the era when the French Emperor became the most formidable figure in Europe, with legendary victories like Austerlitz and Jena-Austerlitz. Napoleon struck fear across the continent, proving himself a military genius. But where there is glory, there is also downfall. Napoleon soared to high, and it was that very power that began to cloud his judgment. The beginning of his collapse, the invasion of Russia followed by crushing defeat and eventual abdication, his final attempt to reclaim glory ended in disaster at Waterloo. In today's video by Triumphantly from Spy Room, we will dive into the final chapter of Napoleon's military career. Let's begin. The Russian campaign in October 1809. Napoleon defeated the Fifth Coalition. The French Empire's dominance in Europe was still intact, but the cracks were starting to show. Napoleon began thinking more about securing his dynasty. At the time, he and Empress Josephine had been married for years but remained childless, wanting an heir. Napoleon decided to divorce Josephine and remarry into one of the European royal families allied with France. In November 1809, Napoleon informed Josephine of his decision, and the couple officially divorced in January 1810. Initially, he sought to marry Anna, the sister of Tsar Alexander of Russia. But the Tsar refused, citing her young age. Anna was only 16. Ultimately, Napoleon turned to Austria and married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, in April 1810. This union strengthened ties with Austria but weakened relations with Russia. Almost a year later, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Francois Charles Joseph Napoleon. Meanwhile, Napoleon annexed the Papal States as the Pope opposed his continental system. In retaliation, Pope Pius VII excommunicated the emperor, prompting General Etienne Radet to arrest the Pope. He would remain a prisoner until May 1814. In addition, France annexed Holland and Westphalia. At this point, Napoleon controlled about 40% of Europe's population either directly or through puppet states. However, Napoleon's actions, his marriage to Marie-Louise, the establishment of the Duchy of Warsaw, and appointing Marshal Bernadotte as heir to the Swedish throne angered Tsar Alexander. By December 1810, when France annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, where the Tsar's uncle ruled, tensions escalated further. The Tsar began pulling out of the continental system, allowing British and neutral ships into Russian ports, while banning French imports. Conflict with Russia seemed inevitable, and Napoleon began preparing for a war. By May 1812, France had secured an alliance with Prussia, 20,000 troops, and Austria 30,000 troops. With initial mobilization, Napoleon amassed around 450,000 soldiers, with reinforcements. The total force reached nearly 690,000, making it the largest European campaign in history at that point. His army included 1,400 artillery pieces, 30,000 artillerymen, and 80,000 cavalry, with 180,000 to 200,000 horses. Russia, in turn, mobilized about 700,000 regular troops and 223,000 militia, supported by 1,372 artillery pieces. On June 22, 1812, Napoleon officially launched his invasion of Russia, calling it the Second Polish War. From Lithuania, he issued a proclamation: "Soldiers, the Second Polish War has begun." The first ended at Friedland, where Russia vowed eternal alliance with France and war with Britain. But that vow has been broken. Russia offers no explanation except demanding we retreat beyond the Rhine and abandon our allies. Russia believes we are weakened, that we are no longer the same army of Austerlitz. It forces us to choose between dishonor and war. The choice is clear: cross the Niemen and bring war to their land. This war will bring as much glory as the First, but it is peace, forged by victory, that will and the suffering Russia has imposed upon Europe for 50 years. The French army crossed the Niemen River and advanced into Russian territory. Russian forces were led by General Mikhail Barclay de Tolly, who chose a defensive strategy, retreating steadily while destroying supplies to deny them to the enemy. Russia aimed to draw the French deeper into hostile territory, stretching their supply lines and forcing attrition. As Napoleon advanced, he lost his key advantage, speed. Within weeks, tens of thousands died from disease and harsh conditions. Desertions were rampant. With extended supply lines and no captured Russian stockpiles, the French army suffered food shortages. From July through mid-August, the two armies clashed repeatedly in small-scale battles, both sides scoring minor victories and losses. By mid-August, Napoleon moved towards Smolensk, where Russian forces had gathered, initially planning to winter. In Vilnius, Napoleon changed strategy due to new developments. Marshal Bonaparte had allied with Russia. The Russo-Ottoman War ended with the Treaty of Bucharest. Russian forces were consolidating at Smolensk. Under pressure from his officers and troops, Barclay de Tolly had to prepare for battle just as Napoleon hoped. On August 14th, Marshal Ney crossed the Dnieper River and won at Krasnoy the next day. Napoleon celebrated his birthday with a military parade and positioned his troops west of Smolensk. The main French force arrived on August 16th. The Battle of Smolensk from August 16th to 18th. The two sides engaged in a large-scale clash. Napoleon surrounded the southern banks of the Dnieper, while Russian forces held the north. On the night of August 17, as Napoleon launched a full assault, Barclay decided to abandon the city to avoid a catastrophic defeat. When French forces entered Smolensk, the Russian army had already retreated eastward. French generals launched a pursuit, hoping to land a decisive blow, but were halted at Valiatino, where 35,000 French troops clashed with 25,000 Russian rearguards. Though inconclusive, the Russians succeeded in delaying the French. Napoleon now faced two options: chase the Russian army all the way to Moscow, halt and wait out the winter. He chose to press forward despite warnings from his generals. The road to Moscow on August 24th. The French marched toward Moscow. Napoleon left General Bessières in Smolensk to stabilize supply lines. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander replaced Barclay with General Kutuzov, fresh from the Ottoman front. Kutuzov recognized the wisdom of Barclay's retreat strategy, but also knew that continued withdrawal would destroy Russian morale. He decided to make. Shortly afterward, the Russians launched a counteroffensive and regained their forward positions. By 6 p.m., after reorganizing their defenses, General Kutuzov declared a Russian victory. Morale soared among Russian troops and officers. However, Kutuzov still ordered a retreat from Borodino due to the heavy losses they had sustained. His priority was to preserve the Russian army's core strength and wait for the right opportunity to achieve a decisive victory. The Battle of Borodino ended as the bloodiest single-day battle of the 19th century. Nearly 270,000 troops from both sides engaged in brutal combat. French casualties ranged from 35,000 to 42,000, including the loss of around 50 generals and officers. Russian losses were even higher, estimated between 37,000 and 53,000. Including 27 generals and officers. Napoleon declared victory, citing the Russian retreat from Borodino. However, the reality was that the Russian army had preserved its main force despite suffering heavy losses. While the French were increasingly worn down, this marked a severe blow to French morale. Napoleon decided to halt his advance at Moscow, hoping to receive reinforcements and supplies over the winter before resuming his campaign in the spring. On September 14th, the French army reached Moscow. However, by then, Russian logistics were almost exhausted, and the French supply lines were overextended. Moscow itself had been abandoned. Tsar Alexander, the citizens, and the military had evacuated. The city was torched. Tsar Alexander resolutely refused any peace negotiations. The French army, now short on food, clothing, and medical supplies, found themselves constantly harassed by Russian partisans and guerrilla fighters. Meanwhile, Kutuzov remained steadfast in his defensive strategy, and the harsh Russian winter began to set in after nearly 5 fruitless weeks in Moscow. With no prospect of convincing the Tsar to negotiate, Napoleon began his retreat on October 19th towards Smolensk. The retreat lasted until December and was catastrophic. The French troops suffered massive losses due to starvation, inadequate clothing, lack of medical care, constant guerrilla attacks, and the brutal cold. Along the way, they faced several ambushes by the Russian army. The most devastating moment came at the Berezina River, from November 26th to 20th. The French struggled desperately to cross the river while under constant Russian attack, though Napoleon and a significant portion of his army managed to cross. They had to abandon an entire wing of their forces. By December, Napoleon left the army to return to Paris quickly, entrusting command to Marshal Ney, who was himself ill. On December 14th, the remnants of the French army exited Russian territory. The invasion of Russia had ended in total disaster. The number of survivors who returned to France varies by account. Some say just over 100,000. Others estimate 70,000, and some claim fewer than 20,000 made it back alive. Regardless of the exact figure, the truth remains. Napoleon's Russian campaign was a crushing failure with staggering losses. This defeat plunged the French Empire into crisis. Napoleon's prestige crumbled, giving his enemies the opportunity to rally against him. The Sixth Coalition War was soon declared. The nightmare in Russia was only the beginning of Napoleon's downward spiral. As the European powers sensed weakness, they quickly mobilized against France. Even Prussia, which had recently fought alongside Napoleon in Russia, now turned against him. France was in dire straits. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were lost in Russia. Tens of thousands more were stranded in Spain, and the British Navy had blockaded the seas. Still, Napoleon did not falter. He launched a massive conscription campaign and mobilized the population. Within months, he raised a new army of several 100,000 men, though many were inexperienced conscripts. Despite the lack of seasoned troops and experienced officers, Napoleon still commanded a sizable force to confront the coalition. He decided to strike preemptively, moving toward the Rhine to link up with remaining units there. His goal was to attack before the enemy could fully regroup. In April 1813, Napoleon advanced toward Leipzig, assigning Marshal Devout to hold Hamburg. During the march, Napoleon suffered his first loss when Marshal Bessières was killed, deeply grieving Napoleon and fueling his resolve to defeat the coalition on May 2, 1813. The Battle of Lutzen took place between French forces and the Russo-Prussian army. Napoleon fielded 78,000 troops against the coalition's 93,000. He had earlier ordered Marshal Ney to move ahead to Lutzen, while he marched toward Leipzig if the enemy attacked Ney's forces. Napoleon planned to flank them. Russian commander Wittgenstein, replacing the late Kutuzov, decided to strike Ney's course, mistakenly believing it to be isolated. Once battle commenced, the coalition realized too late that French numbers were larger than expected. Ney's mostly raw troops fought fiercely. Napoleon, upon hearing the news, swiftly arrived with reinforcements. Thanks to superior artillery and strong defensive positions, the French eventually forced the coalition to retreat. Despite this tactical victory, the French suffered heavy losses and lacked cavalry to pursue After Lutzen, both sides agreed to a truce to rebuild their forces. During this time, the coalition persuaded Austria to join them. When the truce ended, fighting resumed on August 26th. The coalition won a victory at the Battle of Katzbach. That same day, Napoleon engaged a large coalition force at Dresden. The next day, the French secured a major victory, but again lacked the strength to follow through. Dresden would prove to be Napoleon's last great victory in the Sixth Coalition War. Following months of attrition, both sides clashed in a decisive Battle of Leipzig. From October 16th to 19th, Napoleon deployed nearly 200,000 troops, while the coalition outnumbered him 2-1. With over 600,000 soldiers fighting over 3 brutal days, making it the largest battle in Europe. Before World War I, fierce combat broke out across the battlefield on October 16th, while the coalition initially had the upper hand. Napoleon launched fierce counterattacks and regained several strategic positions, yet his offensives failed to break through the coalition's fortified lines. On October 17th, coalition reinforcements under Count Bennigsen and Crown Prince Charles John of Sweden arrived. On October 18th, the coalition surrounded the French and unleashed relentless assaults, leading to immense casualties on both sides. Prussian forces eventually broke through, forcing the French into a chaotic retreat. As French forces pulled back into Leipzig, disaster struck. A panicked corporal prematurely detonated the bridge over the river, stranding thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Though Napoleon escaped, the French suffered catastrophic losses, 38,000 dead, and between 30,000 to 36,000 wounded or captured. The coalition also lost at least 50 for 1,000 troops, but they had shattered Napoleon's main army. One by one, his allies abandoned him. Even Marshal Ney switched sides to protect his. On April 1st, the French Senate passed a decree deposing Napoleon. At Fontainebleau with 40,000 exhausted troops, Napoleon planned to march on Paris, but his marshals refused to fight a hopeless war. They demanded he abdicate. Initially, he proposed abdicating in favor of his son, with Marie-Louise as regent. But Tsar Alexander rejected this and demanded a full abdication on April 6th. Napoleon agreed. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed on April 11th. Napoleon renounced all claims to the French throne and was exiled to Elba, a small island off the Tuscan coast. He was allowed to rule it as a sovereign prince and retain the title of emperor, receiving an annual pension of 2 million francs from France. He could bring for 100 personal attendants and guards. Napoleon's exile on Elba lasted just over half a year. He arrived in early May 1814 and immediately began plotting his return. Many French still saw him as a hero. Several generals remained loyal, and most importantly, the French people despised King Louis XVIII. His time on Elba was marked by frustration, cut off from his wife and son, and grieving the death of his beloved Josephine in late May. The pension never arrived, and rumors began to swirl about exiling him to a remote island in the Atlantic. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. Taking advantage of a lapse in Anglo-French surveillance, he escaped Elba with a few hundred soldiers and followers. By March 1st, he landed in France at Golfe and marched toward Paris. King Louis XVIII dispatched troops to arrest him. On March 7, Napoleon encountered the 5th Regiment south of Grenoble. He approached alone and shouted, "Here I am. If any of you would shoot your emperor, do it now." Instead, the troops erupted, "Vive l'Empereur," and joined him. Every unit sent to arrest him instead turned and followed. By the time he reached Lyon, Napoleon had 8,000 troops and 30 cannons at his side. On the 14th, Marshal Ney who had once promised King Louis XVIII that he would arrest Napoleon and deliver him back in an iron cage, instead defected and joined the former emperor with 6,000 troops. Thus, as Napoleon marched toward Paris, he continued to win over French troops along the way. By the 19th, King Louis XVIII was forced to flee the Tuileries Palace and head north toward the city of Beauvais. The following evening, Napoleon occupied the Tuileries and quickly took control of Paris, restoring the imperial regime, within just 3 weeks from being a man in exile accompanied by only a few hundred followers. Napoleon had once again become the Emperor of France, the Royalist. Forces quickly rose in resistance. They posed little serious threat. But Napoleon's return threatened the balance of power in Europe, prompting the European powers to swiftly form a new alliance and declare war on France. This marked the beginning of the Seventh Coalition War, the final chapter in the Napoleonic Wars. Even before Napoleon had fully reclaimed power, members of the previous Sixth Coalition had already declared him an outlaw. Soon after, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia joined forces to form the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing their armies to confront him. Each nation contributed significant forces, bringing the total strength of the coalition to over 700,000 soldiers, while Napoleon had only around 100,000 troops ready for immediate combat. Realizing that negotiation was no longer an option, Napoleon's only hope lay in striking quickly, defeating his enemies before they could unite. His plan was to crush the Southern Coalition forces, particularly in Wallonia, before they could receive reinforcements. If he could force Britain to withdraw and knock Prussia out of the war, he hoped to negotiate a favorable peace with Austria and Russia, though still outnumbered. Napoleon knew that Britain and Prussia were not fully prepared. Many in Belgium still supported him, and the British troops stationed there were not elite forces. The British were commanded by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians by Gebhard Lebrecht von Bilacher. Napoleon decided to act first. On June 15, 1815, he split his forces into 3 wings, the left under Marshal Ney, the right under Marshal Grouchy, and he himself led the reserves. French troops crossed the border near Charleroi, overwhelming the coalition's forward positions, allowing Napoleon to wedge himself between Wellington and Blücher, preventing them from joining forces. Late that night, Wellington received confirmation from Dutch sources that the main French attack was indeed at Charleroi at dawn on June 16. Wellington was shocked by the speed of Napoleon's advance. He rushed to Quatre-Bras, where Dutch forces under Prince William of Orange and German units under the Duke of Brunswick were holding ground against Ney. Napoleon had ordered Ney to seize the crossroads at Quatre-Bras, crucial for linking up with Napoleon's main force if needed. That day, the French launched a fierce assault. Despite heavy losses, the Allied troops managed to hold their ground. Meanwhile, Napoleon personally attacked Blücher's Prussian forces at Ligny. Delivering a decisive blow, the Prussian center collapsed under French pressure, but their flanks held firm. This defeat forced Wellington to withdraw from Quatre-Bras and reposition his troops northward to a defensive location he had scouted the previous year, the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, just south of the village of Waterloo. Though the Prussians began retreating from Ligny, they were not pursued aggressively. Many units remained in position until midnight, with some only moving out the next morning. This lack of French pursuit allowed the Prussians to make a critical tactical decision not to retreat east along their supply lines, but instead to head north to Waver, keeping close contact with Wellington. Napoleon's plan to split the British and Prussian armies had ultimately failed. On June 17th, he joined Ney at Quatre-Bras and pursued Wellington, though only a brief cavalry skirmish occurred near Genappe before leaving Ligny. Napoleon had ordered Grouchy to follow the retreating Prussians, but due to delays and vague instructions, Grouchy failed to stop them from reinforcing Wellington. By June 18th. Both armies were positioned for the final showdown at Waterloo. Unlike during the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon did not initiate a full-scale national mobilization. His army was composed mostly of battle-hardened veterans, 73,000 men and 150 cannons. Wellington commanded 68,000 troops and 156 guns, while Blücher had about 50,000 troops and 126 cannons. Though they were stationed more than 12 kilometers away and would not join the battle immediately, Ellington chose a defensive position on the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge. Knowing his troops were less experienced, he relied on the terrain and prepared to hold rather than attack. The battlefield was only about 4 kilometers wide, allowing him to concentrate his forces. Napoleon positioned his troops on the southern ridge, but due to poor visibility, he had little intel on Wellington's exact deployment. His plan was to launch a diversionary attack to draw out reserves, bombard the center with artillery, and then launch a flank assault from the left, aiming to push Wellington's army toward the sea and away from Prussian reinforcements. Rain delayed the battle until midday, giving Blücher's forces time to get closer. Round 1 p.m., French artillery opened fire. The bombardment was light, aimed more at disrupting morale than causing destruction. Shortly after, Napoleon learned that Prussian forces were just 7 to 8 kilometers from his right flank. He sent orders to Grouchy to intercept them, but Grouchy, still following earlier orders, was too far away. He didn't receive the message until late afternoon and remained inactive, still believing he could defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived. Napoleon launched a major infantry assault. French divisions advanced in battalion columns, concentrating firepower but limiting maneuverability. Heavy fighting ensued. The British lines buckled, prompting the cavalry brigades to charge and relieve pressure. Though outnumbered, these British cavalrymen disrupted French formations and artillery before being repelled by French cavalry. Napoleon then committed large cavalry forces of his own, over 9,000 horsemen, against Wellington center. But British infantry had formed square formations, deadly to cavalry. These tight-knit formations, reinforced by artillery at the center, resisted charge after charge. Poor coordination between French cavalry and artillery meant the squares held firm. Though costly and time-consuming, the charges failed to break the British lines. Round 6 p.m., the French captured the key strongpoint of La Haye-Saint. Napoleon then brought up horse-drawn artillery to pound the British squares, causing heavy casualties. Wellington was on the brink of collapse, but just then, the Prussians arrived, having broken through Grouchy's blocking force. Their appearance on the battlefield tipped the scales. Napoleon's exhausted army now faced overwhelming opposition on two fronts. French reserves had been spent, and they could not defend both their center and right flank. By 7:30 p.m., French units were collapsing under Prussian pressure. In a last desperate move, Napoleon sent in his Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, but they too were repelled by coordinated British and Prussian forces. Soon, French lines broke. Panic spread. Only a few guards and reserve troops kept any order as Napoleon fled the field. The Battle of Waterloo ended in disaster for France: 25,000 killed or wounded, 8,000 captured, and 15,000 missing. The Allies also suffered. Wellington lost 17,000 men, 13,700 killed or wounded, 3,300 missing, while Blücher lost 5,600 with another 1,400 missing. Waterloo ended all hope for Napoleon's reign. He returned to Paris and abdicated on June 22nd. The French government publicly announced it 2 days later. On June 29th, Napoleon left Paris and retired to the Château de Malmaison. Once Josephine's residence stopped by June 28th, Allied forces were nearing Paris. Napoleon initially planned to flee to America, but British ships had blockaded the ports. With no other options, he surrendered on July 15th. This time, the Allies ensured he would never escape again. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, over 1,800 kilometers from Africa in the South Atlantic. He was kept under constant surveillance, with British naval patrols surrounding the island. Living conditions were harsh. Governor Hudson Lowe treated him coldly, further adding to his discomfort. Still, Napoleon maintained imperial decorum, insisting his attendants speak formally and respectfully. He spent much of his time reading and writing, with little else to do in the years that followed. His health declined. By May 1821, he was bedridden, and on May 5th, he died just shy of his 52nd birthday. His last recorded words were, "France, the army, Josephine," in his will. He wished to be buried by the banks of the Seine, but Governor Lowe refused. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena. It was